quiet depths of space, an ancient alien signal was intercepted by Earth's most advanced listening post. The message was faint, at first a whisper across the stars, so weak that it barely reached the human ear at all. For months, the scientists and engineers working on the project could only track the pattern but couldn't make sense of it. The signal seemed like a broken frequency repeating a single line over and over again, a phrase no one could decipher at first, a sequence of strange symbols and static, but it was clear something important was being said. As the weeks passed, the deciphering team worked tirelessly to decode the strange message. After the best minds on Earth failed to interpret it by traditional means, the signal was handed over to a special team of linguists, mathematicians, and physicists who believed that the message wasn't a language at all, but a complex set of frequencies meant to convey meaning through resonance. They spent days isolating patterns within the noise, listening for a hint of clarity. Their work was grueling and slow, but they were driven by the knowledge that something truly extraordinary lay hidden within the message. It was on the 32nd day of analysis when they finally made a breakthrough. The message suddenly became clear, though still cryptic in its simplicity. It repeated the same line again and again, never changing, never wavering. The message was simple yet terrifying, and it said in perfect English, "Never wake them." The room fell silent as the words reverberated through the minds of those who heard it. There was no mistake. This was a direct warning from an intelligence far older than humanity itself. The implications were immediately apparent. Someone or something had tried to communicate across time and space, warning them about Earth and whatever lay beneath it. At first, the researchers were skeptical. Was this a hoax? Was it some elaborate prank or a coincidence of natural interference? But as they examined the signal further, the evidence mounted. The signal had not only come from a point in space no one had ever charted, but the content itself was too deliberate to ignore. The energy signature matched nothing recorded in Earth's history, and no known civilization could have created such a message. It had to be from someone or something far beyond what humanity had ever encountered. News of the discovery spread quickly. The scientific community was abuzz with excitement, but there was an underlying current of unease. No one could shake the feeling that this message was not meant for humanity's eyes, but that someone had made a grave mistake by sending it, or perhaps someone had wanted it to be found all along. The more they looked into the origins of the signal, the more questions arose. Where did it come from? Who sent it? And why did they send it? The answers seemed to lie in the deep void of space beyond the known stars. No one had ever explored this far before, and yet the message pointed directly to Earth, the very cradle of human life itself. With no clear answers and the mystery deepening, a group of explorers and scientists were assembled to investigate further. Their mission was simple at first. They were to track the origin of the signal and find any trace of the alien civilization that might have sent it. But the warning was clear. The message was not one of greeting. It was a call to stay away at all costs. They had been warned, never wake them. A team of explorers was selected to follow the signal's path into the unknown. They were the best humanity had to offer, seasoned astronauts, engineers, and scientists from every field, united in their mission to unravel the mystery that lay in the far reaches of space. The crew's first task was to track the source of the signal using every tool at their disposal. They analyzed the electromagnetic readings, triangulated the signal's origin, and mapped the coordinates with precision. But the farther they traveled, the more the reality of their situation began to set in. They were heading toward the edge of the known galaxy, toward a place no human had ever gone before. As the journey continued, strange things began to happen during their travel. The crew began to notice subtle anomalies with their equipment. At first, it was nothing more than minor glitches in the navigation system. But soon they found the anomalies becoming more frequent. Strange fluctuations in the ship's power grid, unexplained interference in communications, and bizarre static noises in the air vents. It seemed like something was wrong, but no one could pinpoint the cause. The engineers assured everyone that the ship was operating within normal parameters, but the crew couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A strange tension began to build as the ship neared its destination. The message never left their minds. The words, "Never wake them," echoed like a warning bell in their thoughts, and it gnawed at them all, but curiosity pushed them forward despite the unease, despite the instinct to turn back. They pressed on, unsure of what they would find, but certain that the answers lay just beyond their reach. They knew the signal had come from a place that had been untouched for eons, and that they were the first to uncover it, humanity's first step into an unknown history. As the crew reached the star system where the signal originated, their sensors detected something remarkable. A planet appeared within the system, where none had been before. It was an uncharted world that had somehow gone unnoticed until now, and it was here that the signal had led them. But what they found upon arrival sent shockwaves through the crew. The planet was covered in thick clouds, and strange electromagnetic interference made it nearly impossible to get a clear read of the surface. Something was hiding beneath the fog, something that couldn't be seen or understood yet. With no clear way to proceed, the crew made preparations to land on the surface. They suited up and boarded the descent module, which would take them through the planet's thick atmosphere. Once on the surface, they would begin their investigation and try to uncover the mystery that had been hidden for so long. They were filled with equal parts excitement and fear. This was the moment they had been preparing for, but deep down they knew that the warning was not without reason, that something terrible could be waiting for them just out of sight. The landing was smooth, but as the crew stepped out onto the planet's surface, they were greeted by an eerie silence. The air was still, and the ground seemed perfectly intact, as if untouched by time. But there was something deeply unsettling about it all. They moved cautiously through the landscape, scanning for signs of life, but nothing seemed to stir, not a single creature, not even a rustle in the wind. The landscape appeared like a dead world, but the ruins and advanced technology scattered across the surface told a different story. This place had once been alive, but now it was dormant, frozen in time, awaiting the inevitable arrival of those who had ignored the warning. As the explorers ventured deeper into the abandoned cities, the first thing they noticed was the unnatural stillness. There were no signs of movement, no wildlife or plant life. As far as the eye could see, just the remains of a long-forgotten civilization. The buildings were immense and constructed with materials that defied their understanding. Everything was too perfect, too deliberate, as though the architects had known exactly what they were doing. And yet everything was completely still, as if the world had come to a standstill at the very moment they arrived. The team moved cautiously through the ruins, scanning the structures for any sign of life or activity. But the deeper they went, the more the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every step echoed in the empty streets, and every sound felt amplified, as if the planet itself was listening to their every move. There were no creatures, no signs of life, and yet the silence was so complete that it seemed unnatural. It was as if something far more intelligent and powerful was observing them from the shadows hidden just beyond the reach of their senses. They came across their first clue as they approached what appeared to be a central square within one of the cities. The square was surrounded by towering statues of figures. They could not identify these beings, were not human. Their features were elongated, and their forms seemed almost abstract. They were sculptures of creatures so alien that even the most seasoned xenobiologists could not classify them. But the strangest thing about the statues was that they were carved into the stone itself, not just placed there as monuments, but integrated into the very fabric of the city, as if these beings had once been part of the planet's existence itself. In the center of the square, they found something even more perplexing, a massive stone obelisk covered in intricate symbols and markings, some of which appeared to move when viewed from different angles. The obelisk seemed to hum with a faint energy, as though it were alive in some way. The team gathered around it, carefully inspecting the markings and attempting to decipher its meaning. But the symbols were unlike anything they had ever seen before. No known language on Earth could account for them, and the technology used to carve them into the stone seemed far beyond anything humanity had ever achieved. As they examined the obelisk, a sudden jolt of energy shot through the ground beneath them. It was subtle at first, but it grew stronger with each passing second. The crew members exchanged worried glances. Something was happening. They felt a shift in the air around them, as though the planet itself had begun to stir. The obelisk began to glow faintly at first, but it grew brighter as if responding to their presence. A low rumbling sound vibrated through the ground, and the team could feel the pulse of energy emanating from deep within the planet. It was as if they had triggered something ancient, something that had been dormant for eons. They stepped back in alarm, unsure of what to do. But before they could react, the ground began to crack open, and a dark shadow emerged from beneath the surface. The figure was massive, and unlike anything they had ever encountered. It was a silhouette at first, its form barely visible in the growing light. But as it moved closer, they saw its shape more clearly. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs, and an aura of power that radiated from it. The figure was not just a being, it was something far greater. It was as if the planet itself had come alive and was now watching them. The explorers stood frozen, their hearts racing, their minds struggling to comprehend what they were seeing, and just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, disappearing back into the shadows below the surface, leaving the crew with more questions than answers. They were no longer alone. Something had awoken, something that they had never been meant to find, and the true mystery of Earth was beginning to reveal itself. The crew stood in stunned silence, their eyes locked on the spot where the shadowy figure had vanished. Every instinct screamed at them to run, but curiosity held them in place. They had just encountered something far beyond their understanding, and they couldn't bring themselves to look away. The air around them felt thick with tension, as if the very fabric of reality was warping under the presence of whatever had emerged from the depths. The low rumble of the planet's core reverberated through the ground, and it sent a chill down their spines. The team's leader, Captain Marla Cruz, motioned for the group to regroup and take a step back, but even as they moved away from the obelisk, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as though the planet itself was alive and aware of their presence. The silence stretched on, so heavy and oppressive that it felt almost suffocating. They had come looking for answers, but all they had found so far were more questions and more unsettling signs that the warnings about Earth were not only real but far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. They decided to continue their investigation, but with more caution this time. The team split up to explore different sections of the city, hoping to find anything that might offer more insight into what had just occurred. As they moved deeper into the ruins, they began to notice strange patterns embedded in the architecture, odd symbols and carvings that seemed to appear in places where no one had thought to look before. They were everywhere, hidden in plain sight, as if the city itself was designed to conceal its true purpose, or perhaps to protect it from discovery. Dr. Alicia Munro, the team's linguist, was the first to spot something that might finally help them make sense of the symbols. She had been carefully examining the carvings on a nearby wall when she noticed a repeating sequence of shapes that appeared to align with the markings on the obelisk. She called the rest of the team over, and they all gathered around the wall. It was a pattern that seemed to tell a story, a history of this lost civilization. But the meaning was still elusive. The language was unlike anything they had encountered before. The symbols were not just writing, but a form of communication that combined visual elements with what could only be described as energy fields. The more they examined the symbols, the more they realized that they were connected to the planet itself. The markings weren't just carved into the stone, they were part of the stone. The energy in the carvings seemed to pulse and shift, as though responding to their presence. Each symbol that they touched seemed to resonate with a faint hum vibrating through the air and into their bones. It was clear that these symbols were far more than just art. They were a language of power, a language that controlled something much larger than anyone had anticipated. As they continued to examine the wall, they began to uncover more disturbing truths. Hidden within the carvings, there were references to an ancient race that had once inhabited the planet, a race that had merged with the planet's core itself, transforming into something beyond flesh and bone. They had transcended their physical forms and become a part of Earth's very essence. They were the original inhabitants, the ones who had built this world, and the ones who had left the warnings behind. The more they deciphered, the more they realized the truth that this planet was not just a home to an ancient civilization. It was the resting place of something far more powerful, something that could not be understood by mere mortals. The civilization had known this and had attempted to contain it before it could escape, before it could spread across the galaxy. The message had been left not just for the universe, but for the very beings who would one day awaken it. The message was simple and terrifying: never wake them. As the realization sank in, a deep rumbling echoed from beneath the ground, Once again, the silence had been broken. But this time it was different. This time the ground trembled as if responding to their discovery. Something had been disturbed, something that could no longer be ignored. The ground continued to tremble beneath their feet, as if the entire planet was coming alive in response to their intrusion. The team stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear and realization. They had triggered something far beyond their understanding, something ancient and powerful that had been waiting for eons for a moment like this. The rumble intensified, sending vibrations up through their bodies, as though the very core of the planet was awakening from a long slumber. The obelisk began to glow again, its symbols shifting and swirling as the energy beneath the surface surged to the surface. The sky above darkened as storm clouds began to form, rapidly swirling into a violent vortex above them. It was as though the planet was reacting to their presence in ways they couldn't comprehend. The winds picked up with force that felt unnatural, and the air crackled with energy. The crew scrambled to find cover, but the storm was upon them too quickly. They barely had time to react before lightning began to strike the ground around them with deadly accuracy. Captain Marla Cruz shouted for everyone to get back to the ship, but the moment they turned to make their way through the city, they were met with an eerie silence. The storm raged above them, but the streets were now devoid of the usual sounds of wind and rain. It was as if the planet had gone completely still again, but this time the stillness felt heavier, it felt wrong. And as they moved through the desolate streets, it became clear that something was tracking them, something they couldn't see but knew was there. The team's engineer, Benjamin Ryder, was the first to notice the subtle changes in the environment. The air seemed to vibrate with an unseen force, and the ground beneath them seemed to shift slightly, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. He had barely a moment to react before the ground beneath his feet cracked open, sending him tumbling into a chasm that had suddenly appeared beneath him. The rest of the team rushed to his side, but they were too late. The crack had already sealed itself, and Benjamin was gone. The team stood in horror, unable to comprehend what had just happened. They had been so close to the ship, so close to safety, but now they were trapped in a city that was shifting and changing beneath their feet, as if the planet itself was conspiring against them. It was then that they heard the sound of something moving in the darkness, a low guttural hum that reverberated through their bones, as though the planet itself was breathing. They tried to move, but every step felt heavier, as if the air itself was thick with resistance. The closer they got to the ship, the stronger the feeling of being pursued became. It was as though something was stalking them from the shadows, watching them with a presence that sent shivers down their spines. They knew they were no longer alone. The entity that had awakened was no mere force of nature. It was intelligent, and it had been waiting for them. As they reached the ship, the lights flickered wildly, and the doors failed to open. The crew had no choice but to leave the safety of the ship behind and try to make their way back to the central square where they had first encountered the obelisk. They hoped that somehow they could reverse the process, whatever they had triggered. But the path was growing more perilous with each passing moment. Every turn they took seemed to lead them deeper into the heart of the city, where the unknown entity was closing in on them. The ground continued to shift and tremble beneath them. The sky above darkened even further, and the hum of the planet grew louder and more insistent. They had disturbed something ancient, something that had been waiting for a long time, and now it was awake and angry, and there was no way to turn back. The team's pace quickened as they fled toward the central square, their breaths shallow and frantic. Every step they took seemed to push them further into the heart of the mystery. The hum of the planet grew louder and more pronounced, vibrating through the air and deep into their bones. It was like a pulse, a heartbeat that resonated in time with their own. The world around them felt alive. Every surface seemed to shift and tremble in response to their movements, as though the planet was watching them, moving with them. The sky above darkened even further until it was a deep shade of black, almost like the void of space, and the winds howled through the empty streets with an unnatural intensity. The buildings around them seemed to close in, narrowing their paths and forcing them toward the square. The streets were no longer familiar. The city itself was changing, twisting and reshaping before their eyes. Every corner they turned led them deeper into the unknown, and the feeling of being hunted grew stronger with each passing moment. Suddenly, Captain Marla Cruz stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide with terror, as she stared at the ground ahead of her. The others turned to follow her gaze, and froze. A massive shadow had appeared just beyond the square. It was tall and formless, stretching up from the depths of the earth, like a creature rising from the very core of the planet. The shadow moved slowly at first, its shape shifting as it rose from the cracks in the ground. It was impossible to tell what it truly was, but one thing was certain: it was not something that belonged to this world. The crew backed away slowly, their hearts racing. As the shadow moved closer, its form still amorphous, but clearly sentient, it seemed to sense their fear and responded by speeding up, its movements growing more distinct with every second. They turned and ran toward the obelisk, hoping that the strange energy source they had activated before might hold the key to stopping this thing. But the closer they got, the more they realized that the obelisk was no longer just a source of energy. It had become a beacon, a signal that was now drawing the shadow toward them. As they neared the square, the ground shifted beneath their feet, sending them tumbling into the open space. The shadow now loomed over them, its form solidifying into something that resembled a towering figure, but its features were alien and impossible to identify. It moved toward them with a slow, deliberate pace, each step sending tremors through the earth. It felt like the very essence of the planet was pushing them closer to their doom. The team scattered in every direction, trying to find cover, but it was as if the ground itself had turned against them. Benjamin Ryder's disappearance had been the first sign of the danger. Now it was clear that whatever had awakened beneath the surface was not just an entity. It was a force that could manipulate the very fabric of reality. It could control the land, the air, and even their own movements. The crew had been reduced to prey, hunted by something that had existed long before they ever set foot on this world. The shadow reached out, its limbs stretching and shifting with impossible speed and precision. It moved with a fluidity that defied the laws of nature, as though it was made of something other than flesh and bone. And just as quickly as it had appeared, it lunged forward. The team scattered in a desperate bid for survival, but there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape. The shadow was everywhere, and it was closing in with every passing second. They were no longer in control. They were at the mercy of an ancient force that had been waiting for them to arrive. The team scattered in panic as the shadow loomed closer, each member running in a different direction, hoping to outrun or outsmart the entity that had awakened from the planet's core. But no matter how fast they ran, no matter where they hid, the shadow seemed to be everywhere, its presence suffocating and relentless, as if the very fabric of reality bent to its will. The wind howled around them, growing colder and more intense with every passing moment. The sky above churned with a violent energy that mirrored the storm below. Captain Marla Cruz could hear the footsteps of her crew members echoing in the distance, but the fear inside her made it impossible to focus on anything but the looming darkness. She couldn't see the shadow clearly, but she could feel it closing in on her with a terrifying certainty. It was as though it could see her through the fabric of reality itself. It was hunting them one by one, and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She knew it was only a matter of time before they were all caught. Desperation set in as the crew realized their only hope lay in activating the central power source that had triggered the initial wave of energy. The obelisk had somehow created a connection to the heart of the planet itself, and if they could reverse the energy flow, they might be able to stop the shadow, or at the very least force it back into its dormant state. The problem was that they had no idea how to control the obelisk. The symbols on it had shifted and pulsed in ways that were impossible to decipher, but Marla knew there was no choice. They had to try. She rallied the remaining crew members who had managed to find some semblance of cover and led them back toward the obelisk. With each step, the ground trembled beneath them. The air seemed to become thicker, more oppressive, and the shadow was closer now. It could feel their every movement. It could taste their fear, and it wasn't going to let them escape so easily. They reached the obelisk, and Marla felt a cold chill as she stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the glowing symbols. The moment her fingers made contact, the energy surged through her body. Her vision blurred, and the world around her seemed to spin. The power of the obelisk flooded her senses, overwhelming her mind with images and sounds that made no sense at first. But then the understanding hit her like a lightning bolt. She could see the planet as it once was before it had become what it was now. The beings who had once lived here had merged with the land itself, becoming one with its core. Their consciousness had fused with the planet, and they had become the energy that now surged beneath the surface. The obelisk wasn't just a device, it was a doorway, a link to the very essence of the planet itself. And the shadow was not just an entity, it was a part of that essence, a manifestation of the planet's consciousness, one that had been locked away for eons, waiting for the moment when it could return and reclaim the world it had once ruled. Marla knew what she had to do, but the cost was unimaginable. She had to sacrifice herself to stop the shadow, to sever the link between the planet's consciousness and the shadow that had been unleashed. If she didn't, the entire crew would perish, and the planet would awaken fully, its dark influence spreading across the galaxy. She made her decision, and without a word she activated the device at the center of the obelisk. The ground shook violently as the power surged through her body. She screamed in agony as the energy tore through her, but she held on long enough to complete the process. The shadow screeched in fury as the connection to the planet was severed. Its form wavered and dissolved into the air, leaving only a faint echo behind. The rumbling of the planet began to subside, and the storm above started to dissipate. Marla collapsed to the ground, her body drained of energy, but she had succeeded. The planet had been forced back into dormancy, and the shadow had been banished. The remaining crew rushed to her side, but she could already feel herself slipping away. Her last thoughts were of the crew who had survived, and the message they would take back to Earth. Never wake them, never disturb the slumber of a world that should remain forgotten. The storm above them had finally calmed as the planet's trembling slowly ceased. The oppressive energy that had gripped the world seemed to fade away into the silence that followed. The shadow was gone. The obelisk's glow had dimmed to a faint pulse before it too faded into nothingness, leaving only the quiet ruins of the city behind. The crew stood in awe and disbelief as they processed what had just happened. Marla Cruz, their captain, the heart of their mission, had sacrificed everything to save them and the planet, but they had no time to mourn her loss. Not yet. The danger was not entirely over. The crew was exhausted, physically and mentally drained from the harrowing experience, but they knew they had to leave this cursed world before something else could awaken, before the planet could shift once more. They made their way back to the ship in silence, their minds still reeling from what they had witnessed and the price that had been paid to end it all. As they climbed aboard the craft, the doors sealed shut behind them, and they lifted off from the surface of the dead world. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were free. As the ship ascended through the atmosphere and the desolate planet shrank beneath them, the crew finally allowed themselves a moment of respite. But even as they left the planet behind, the questions lingered. There were still so many things they didn't understand. Why had the planet been abandoned? Why had the message been sent? And what had the civilization that once lived there hoped to achieve in locking away such a powerful force? Dr. Alicia Munro, the linguist, turned to her colleagues, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. We need to figure out what we've just done. We have to know the truth about what we encountered out there. Captain Cruz's sacrifice cannot be in vain. We have to understand the significance of it all. The rest of the crew nodded in agreement. Though they all knew the cost of the journey had been high, they also knew the importance of what they had learned. The message had been sent for a reason, and it was their responsibility to make sure it was never forgotten. As they prepared to leave the system, they made one last scan of the planet below, hoping for any signs of lingering activity, but all readings showed that the planet had returned to a deep silence. Once again, the energy that had powered the shadow's emergence had been extinguished, leaving nothing but the echoes of an ancient civilization that had been lost to time, and the threat that had once lain beneath the surface was no longer a danger, not for now anyway. But even as they moved farther from the world and entered the vast expanse of space, there was an unsettling feeling among the crew. They had left behind a planet that had once been home to a civilization that had transcended its physical form and merged with the very core of its world. They had severed that connection, but at what cost? They knew the truth that Earth was not the only world to hold such dark secrets, and that there were other places in the universe that still lay hidden, waiting to be uncovered. The message had been clear, and the crew understood its meaning now more than ever. Never wake them, never disturbed the slumber of ancient forces that had been locked away for a reason. The universe was vast and filled with mysteries, but some things were best left undisturbed. They had learned that lesson the hard way, and as they sailed through the stars toward Earth, they knew one thing for certain: they had touched something beyond their understanding, and they had barely escaped with their lives. And they could only hope that humanity would never be foolish enough to wake the things that should remain asleep.